To discuss these developments, I'm joined by John Jordan. He's a former naval intelligence officer. Eric Mandel, director of the Middle East Political Information Network, and Davis Richardson, policy reporter for The Observer. Thank you all for being with us. John Jordan, let's start with you. The president reportedly received information that that attack on the U.S. drone was from a general acting independently or a rogue general, and not necessarily as a result of command from the top, that the Iranian leaders did not, in fact, want this escalation. Now, that intel, combined with the high casualty toll, deterred the president from going ahead with this retaliatory strike. Was that the right move?
Yes, big picture, the Iranian economy is in free fall. It's never faced these type of headwinds since 1979. The regime is unpopular. The Iranian strategy here is to force the United States into some sort of overreaction, which would be bloody, messy loss of life that would force the U.S. through international pressure to lift some of the sanctions or force the Europeans to find workarounds for them, to find the Iranian regime relief. So this is why not responding to this is the wise move. And the trap is set for the Iranians is an elegant one, because now what are they going to do? They're going to attack an airplane with people on it. So then all of a sudden now they're in the position of having to become the bad guy, and it makes it politically easier for Trump to launch an airstrike if he has to. But that's not the administration's goal. The administration's goal is to keep those shipping lanes open and keep the economic pressure on Iran.
Eric, do you agree that retaliating would be playing into Iran's hands, because they're obviously trying to get the U.S. to take it up a notch further, that they're trying to provoke the U.S. into some kind of aggression that will help them drive a bigger wedge between the U.S. and Europe?
Well, I think Iran's advantage is they know that this president does not want to get into kinetic war. And knowing that, they can, by their asymmetric type of war, they can push the limits of what's going on here. So Iran operates in a gray zone. They have covert operations. They have plausible deniability. And if we don't respond in some way, then the weakness will be projected throughout the world.
So you think the U.S. is wrong to not respond at this point?
Well, at this point, the question is at a time of our choosing.
Right.
But I have to say, the president looks so much like President Obama right now when he crossed that red line. And so the similarities here are strong. That doesn't mean that he should just shoot back and maybe fall into a trap. But it does mean that in dealing with the Iranians, we need to really have a clear policy of what we're trying to achieve here. And the maximum pressure campaign, really, we need patience for, and by doing it, we're going to
but Eric,
put more pressure.
It sounds like it's a bit of a contradiction, because you're saying that the maximum pressure campaign is working. And the best way to ensure that that works, some would argue, is to maintain it without leading to any kind of military confrontation or any other distractions. And of course, just to clarify, that red line that you were talking about was what President Obama said would be crossed if Syrian President Bashar al-Assad uses chemical weapons against his own people, which, of course, he did. All right, we're going to give you a chance to respond to that, as well as hear from you, Davis, after the break.
Depuis plus de 2 ans,
For more than 2 years, the message I carry consists of we need to go further in terms of balance in the region. We need an agenda with Iran and our partners in the region that allows us to find a solution to this crisis. We need to continue to frame the Iranian nuclear activities, to go further in time, but we must avoid the escalation of tensions. So I invite all the parties to reason, to calm down and to discuss.
So as far as Iran is concerned, to begin with, the foreign policy advisors were talking on the sidelines. Of course, we are concerned about the situation, and we are banking on diplomatic negotiations, on a political solution to a very tense situation.
All right, let's bring back my panel. John Jordan, a former naval intelligence officer, Eric Mandel, director of the Middle East Political Information Network, and Davis Richardson, policy reporter for The Observer. Davis, do you think that the president did the right move here, or does it, as Eric is saying, signal some weakness on the part of the U.S. to not respond to the downing of a U.S. drone?
I think the president, for once, actually made the correct call in this circumstance. And I'd say that the one thing that President Donald Trump and the Iranian regime actually have in common right now is that they don't want a further military escalation. Iran is still hurting from the sanctions, and Trump campaigned on an anti-interventionist platform. It does seem to me that Republican lawmakers are goading him into further military escalation, as well as his own intelligence agencies.
All right, Eric, I'm going to give you a chance to respond to what we were talking about before the break, because if the Iranian strategy is to coax the U.S. into some kind of aggressive retaliation in order to isolate it further from the Europeans, why would the U.S. take the bait?
Well, I don't know necessarily that's what they have that elegant a plan of what's going on. I do think that when you talk about how do you respond kinetically, you're going to have a difference between a proportional response and a disproportionate response. And what we did have something many years ago where during the Iran-Iraq war, where an American frigate was hit by Iranian mines, and we responded, and about 200 or 300 Iranians were killed. It was Operation Praying Mantis, and that was the end of it. Here, there really needs to be some type of response, sooner or later, of what's there. And truth be told, a disproportionate response is really a better choice than proportionate, because that would be like saying, well, if the Iranians only go this level, we'll only go back. That, I think, will lead to a small simmering type of war, and I don't think that is good. I think basically the president wants to get back to renegotiation. But the unstated thing of what we really want is we want to weaken the Iranian regime, which we're doing with economic sanctions.
Right.
So the Iranian people can rise up and maybe get themselves a life and change the regime.
Although the president and the Trump administration have said that regime change is not the explicit goal, but that the goal, John Jordan, is to prevent Iran from getting nuclear weapons. So what do you make of what Eric Mandel is saying, that perhaps a disproportionate response is the way to send Iran a stronger message?
No, because this allows Iran domestically to play up nationalistic sentiment, divert attention from the unpopularity of the regime and economic hardship. This is a trap being set by the Iranians, and this is very different from Operation Praying Mantis in the 80s, when they set giant sea-anchored mines that would indiscriminately hit and sink ships. The Iranians are doing here is carefully calibrated. Nobody has been killed, and that's a very, very important fact. No human being has been harmed. No ships have been sunk. Everything has been done very carefully so that any action by the U.S. there'll be a body count, there'll be a propaganda bonanza for the Iranians to further drive a wedge between the U.S., Europe, and other countries throughout the world, so as to bring about economic relief from the sanctions. And that is Iran's end game.
All right, but John, the U.S.'s end game is to prevent Iran from getting nuclear weapons. And the Trump administration has argued that the 2015 nuclear deal certainly did not do that at best it only delayed that outcome. We know that the Europeans are pushing hard for diplomacy. There's an emergency meeting of the nations involved in the Iran deal scheduled for Vienna on June 28th next week. John, how do you see the Europeans responding to this?
Well, first of all, the U.S. objective isn't just about nuclear weapons. It's about curtailing their ballistic missile program, and just as much Iranian behavior with regard to stirring up trouble throughout the world and exporting terror and financing Hezbollah. And it's about arresting Iranian behavior writ large. Now, there's a big gap between the European governments and European companies. Right. European governments, Paris, Berlin, and London, are trying to stitch something together, but European companies can't get out of Iran fast enough.
So, Davis, why wouldn't the Europeans, if their shared goal is to prevent Iran from getting a nuclear weapon, is to enhance the conditions for the people of Iran to prevent some of those horrific human rights violations and to curb Iran's military aggressiveness in the region and to stop Iran from sponsoring its terrorist proxies, why wouldn't the Europeans take the approach with the U.S. and join the U.S. with sanctions against Iran, because that would put the squeeze on Tehran a lot faster and a lot more effectively?
Well, I'd say that European companies are in a pretty awkward position because...
Well, the countries.
Right. I'll defer that to Eric.
Which one?
About the countries.
That they are...
Why wouldn't European leaders say, if we do share all of these same goals, What would happen if they did join the Trump administration with renewed sanctions, particularly at this point when the economy is so close to collapse?
Well, actually, the more we threaten Iran, the more that the Russians, Chinese, Europeans will panic and pressure the Iranians to go back and renegotiate, and that is the president's goal here. They should join in here, except that they've had an appeasement policy for quite a long time. They have ignored Hezbollah terror cells that are there. The Germans have found many, many times the Iranians getting nuclear components and have chosen to look the other way. And this is all post-JCPOA. So to try to bring the Europeans in would be great, but this is a situation for American national security interests that we don't...
But how do you see them responding to this? Do you see them cowering under the Iranian pressure and putting, or at least trying to exert more pressure on the Trump administration? Do you see them following the Iranian script that Tehran wants them to follow?
Listen, they've created instincts to bypass the Americans. They despise President Trump. They despise that he withdrew from the unsigned Joint Comprehensive Plan of Action. And so I don't think the Europeans will be helpful. And the Europeans have a long history of placating or trying to placate terrorists or terrorist states. And so I think to protect the citizenry, and they did it going way back to the Palestinian hijackers, where they would release them right after. And same thing going on here with Iran. They, see no evil, speak no evil, hear no evil in regard to it. How that they can claim all these great human rights that they are in favor of, but yet to be defending the leading state sponsor of terror on the American State Department list for so many years is very troubling.
I guess the economic interests, they feel trump all of these concerns. All right, stay right here. I want to get your take on the next story. And of course, Iran is going to be the focus of next week's three-way security summit in Israel. U.S. National Security Advisor John Bolton will be meeting with his counterparts from Israel and Russia in Jerusalem to discuss these developments in the region. I-24 News diplomatic correspondent Ellie Hochenberg has the details.
The way to Middle East stability just might go through Jerusalem. A high-profile summit will convene in Israel amidst rising tensions with Iran.
At the beginning of next week, an unprecedented historic meeting will take place in Jerusalem, a meeting of national security advisors from the U.S., Russia, and Israel. This is a very important summit to ensure stability in the Middle East in turbulent times.
A senior U.S. administration official stated the United States believes Russia may agree now more than ever before to address American and Israeli concerns about Iran's influence in the region. This on the heels of the attack on oil tankers in the Gulf of Oman and Iranian threats to start enriching uranium at a higher level, withdrawing from its nuclear deal commitments. The senior official added that John Bolton's forthcoming visit to Israel would be a, quote, unprecedented diplomatic opportunity to discuss the issues of both the Syria civil war and the Iranian threat, adding that the purpose of the talks would be to see how we can work together to get rid of the main disturbance in the Middle East, the Islamic Republic.
We would hope to make the point in conjunction with the Israelis that we don't see any positive role for the Iranians, and that would extend beyond Syria, to Lebanon, to Iraq, to Yemen, and other places where they are active. And if the Russians recognize that fact, I think we will be very pleased with that outcome.
However, Russia's Security Council secretary already reassured his Iranian counterpart, saying Moscow will update Iran on the results of this meeting. From the Israeli standpoint, there's also the utmost importance to maintaining its freedom of action in Syria against Iranian targets, a goal which is being fostered through ongoing communication with Moscow.
We'll have some more outside.
Okay. With changing and intensifying challenges flooding the Middle East, this trilateral meeting of the two superpowers and Israel in Israel is yet another indication of the solidifying role Jerusalem is playing.
Thank you.
Ellie Hochenberg, I-24 News.
All right, Davis, what do you think is the message that John Bolton will be delivering to Israel?
I think that the message that Bolton is going to send is that regime change honestly could be a possibility. Over the past decade, he's encouraged very much at all of these speaking events held by the MEK, which is the People's Mujahideen of Iran. So I think that when he goes into Israel, he's going to want to send a message that we're strong and that could be on the table as well.
John, is it likely that Bolton is telling Israel that the U.S. has their back should Iran lash out at Israel? Because that is what the Israelis fear, that should things escalate, Iran is going to attack Israel, and then the U.S. may want Israel to not do anything in a similar dynamic that we saw in the Gulf War with Iraq?
That's a great observation, Michelle. Yes, I think that's exactly what's happening. And I think that Israel, seldom have we had an administration that was this in sync with Israeli leadership. And I think Israel is comfortable with our attitudes towards Israel. And I think Israel will play ball on that. Israel sees the big picture, that ultimately regime change in Iran, or at a minimum, an arresting of Iranian misbehavior, is the end goal here. And Israeli retaliation only complicates things.
John, staying with you, how do you see Putin wanting the situation to play out?
That's the great question here. There's a little unreported fact which happened about a week and a half ago, which tells us a lot. And that is Iran, the Russians refused to sell the S-400 missile system to Iran, when in fact they're trying to sell it to everybody else that they can. I think that the Iranians have outlived their usefulness for the Russians. The Russians wanted the Iranians involved in Syria to assist them in restoring the power of Assad, but now they don't really need them. Now the Iranians are just kind of in the way and causing more problems than benefit, bring more costs than benefits to Russia. So I think they're cutting the Iranians loose.
Eric, what do you think Israel needs to hear at this point?
Well, the first thing here is that Russia may want to cut the Iranians, but the Iranians aren't going anywhere. They have hegemonic ambitions. They have their popular mobilization units that are in Syria. They've ethnically cleansed Sunnis. The Russians, it's true, the Russians did not sell that S-300 system, the S-400 system. They have also kicked out Iranian Revolutionary Guards from Tartus, from one of their peers. So they don't want them there. But the Iranians have different ideas, and they are not natural allies, the Iranians and the Russians. But what do the Israelis want? The Israelis would like to have some retrenchment of Iran. Iran has been trying to plant spy networks in the West Bank. They're in Syria. They control Hezbollah, the PIJ. So Israel would like to decrease that.
And that's why the Security Summit was set up in the first place, to address Iran's presence in Syria well before this recent escalation. All right, Eric, thank you so much. Eric Mandel, Davis Richardson, and John Jordan, appreciate it.